Who is God in Goodnight Punpun? There's this man in Goodnight Punpun who follows Punpun for almost his entire life. He has a giant afro, this huge permanent smile, and a face that looks completely different from everything else in the manga. Punpun can summon him by saying a little prayer, and from the time he's a child, he simply accepts that this is God, which sounds simple enough until you actually start watching what God does. He doesn't behave like some wise figure watching over Punpun. He doesn't really guide him, and a lot of the time he seems more interested in making Punpun uncomfortable than helping him. As Punpun gets older, God keeps appearing during increasingly personal moments, sometimes saying things that feel so specific that it becomes difficult to tell whether Punpun is talking to another being or hearing something that was already sitting somewhere in his own mind. And much later in the manga, there's one moment that makes the whole relationship even stranger. God tells Punpun that he isn't God. So, if that's true, who has Punpun been talking to all these years? And why does this thing inside his life have the face of what seems to be a real person? To understand that, you have to go all the way back to when Punpun is a kid, because God enters the story in such a stupid way that you would never guess how important he eventually becomes. Punpun's uncle Yuichi teaches him a little prayer. Dear God, tinkle tinkle hoy. Punpun says it, and suddenly this massive smiling head appears in front of him. That's it. That's God. At this point, the whole thing is basically funny. Punpun is already this tiny cartoon bird living in a world where everyone else looks human. And now he's speaking to a floating man with an afro whenever he wants a divine assistance. Apparently, the ridiculousness was intentional though. Inio Asano later said that when he first introduced God, he mostly did it because he thought the idea was funny. He didn't expect the character to end up being such a large part of the manga, and you feel that in those early appearances. God feels like one of those strange ideas a child accepts without questioning very much. Punpun is young. He doesn't understand the adults around him. He doesn't even understand himself. And suddenly his uncle has given him this strange little method of reaching somebody who supposedly does. So when Punpun wants God, he says the prayer. God appears. For a while, that's basically their relationship, but Punpun doesn't stay a child. His family becomes more complicated. He becomes increasingly isolated. His feelings towards Aiko begin taking over more of his life, and the version of Punpun we see later is very different from that innocent little bird at the beginning. God changes with him, even though visually he barely changes at all. The smile stays, the afro stays, the same stupid face is still there. What changes is what comes out of it. God starts sounding harsher. He knows exactly where Punpun feels weak. He can humiliate him, provoke him, bring up thoughts Punpun clearly doesn't want to deal with. And the further Punpun falls into himself, the more naturally God seems to appear. That's the one strange detail about this relationship. At the beginning, Punpun has to call him. Later, he often doesn't. The childhood ritual starts disappearing, but God doesn't disappear with it. If anything, he becomes easier to reach. That creates a bunch of different possibilities for what he actually is. Maybe he's an imaginary friend Punpun never really outgrew. That would explain why the whole thing starts when he's young. But God is a pretty terrible imaginary friend. He doesn't comfort Punpun very much. He certainly doesn't protect him, and sometimes he seems almost excited to make whatever Punpun is feeling worse. So maybe he's supposed to be Punpun's conscience. That gets you a little closer, but even that doesn't completely fit. God isn't some moral voice constantly telling Punpun what the right thing to do is. He can be petty, disgusting, jealous, cruel. Sometimes what he says feels less like advice and more like the exact thought Punpun wishes he hadn't had. You could call him a hallucination, but Goodnight Punpun makes even that answer strangely difficult because this manga has a bizarre relationship with what counts as real. This is where Pegasus comes in. There's an entire storyline running alongside Punpun's life involving Pegasus and his followers, and for most of it, they seem completely insane. Pegasus is talking about threats to humanity, cosmic forces, the end of the world, and meanwhile, Punpun is dealing with his own life somewhere else. It feels disconnected. Then, Asano later explained that within the logic of the story, Pegasus and his group actually were doing something important. According to him, they prevented some kind of disaster that could have wiped humanity out, while almost everyone else in the manga carried on with no idea what was actually happening. Pegasus probably needs an entire video because that storyline is confusing as hell, but it matters here for one reason. Goodnight Punpun is willing to let something look completely ridiculous and still leave open the possibility that something real is happening underneath it. So for a long time, you can't really rule out the supernatural explanation for God. Maybe Punpun genuinely is talking to something. And then you look at the face. God barely looks like he belongs in the manga. Everyone else is drawn, but God looks like someone took a photograph, crushed it in harsh black and white, and dropped it directly onto the page. What makes that even stranger is Punpun himself. Punpun is an actual person inside the story, yet we almost never see him as one. We see a cartoon bird. Later, his appearance of course changes into completely different shapes depending on what's happening to him, but the point is that he's a real human face who's hidden from us. God has the opposite problem. We don't even know whether he exists, yet he gets one of the most humane looking faces in the entire manga. And apparently that face really did come from a human being. The person most commonly associated with God's appearance is someone known as Kumatsuto, who appears to have been a friend or associate of Asano and is credited for additional help on Goodnight Punpun. An old Japanese post identified Kumatsuto as the model whose photograph was used for God, and that explanation has been repeated by fans for years. There is one problem though. As far as I can find, there isn't some definitive interview where Asano explains the whole thing himself and says exactly why this person was chosen. So there probably isn't some secret religious hidden meaning behind Kumasatsu's identity. At least none that has been confirmed that I've seen. And considering Asano says God originally started because he thought the character was funny, the reason for using that specific face might have been simpler than a lot of people would expect. Maybe his friend just looked funny as God, which is somehow even better. There are early storyboard images where God apparently looked different anyway, meaning the face we now know or associate with it wasn't necessarily some sacred piece of the manga planned years in advance. It seems to have grown into its own meaning, and that actually describes God pretty well as a whole. He begins as this weird joke in Punpun's childhood, then slowly gathers more weight as Punpun grows older. The face doesn't become scarier because Asano starts drawing it differently. It becomes scarier because we understand more about the person looking at it. Then, much later in the story, God finally says something that changes the entire question. He tells Punpun that he isn't actually God. God is simply what Punpun calls him. And Punpun's reaction is basically the same one we've been building towards this whole time. If you aren't God, then what are you? Once he says that, you can go back through everything we've seen and suddenly the pattern becomes much harder to ignore. God knows Punpun's fears because he's there wherever Punpun is afraid. He knows his insecurities because nobody understands those insecurities better than Punpun himself. He can say things that Punpun doesn't want to hear, but very rarely does he seem to possess information that exists completely outside Punpun. Then, near the end of the manga, Punpun finally looks back at the relationship and gives us the closest thing the story ever gives us to a direct answer. He wonders when he first realized that talking to God was really just talking to himself, and suddenly that stupid prayer means something completely different. When Punpun was young, he didn't have the language to understand everything going on inside him. He barely understood the people around him. Then Yuichi gave him a ritual, a name, and a face he could speak to whenever he needed an answer. So Punpun talked to God. As he got older, the ritual stopped mattering because the voice didn't need it anymore. God had become part of the way Punpun experienced his own thoughts. I don't think that means God is simply some evil Punpun living inside him. He's messier than that. Sometimes he humiliates Punpun, sometimes he brings out something Punpun would rather ignore, and sometimes he seems to give a voice to feelings Punpun hasn't officially admitted to himself yet. That's what makes him so uncomfortable. Punpun can experience those thoughts as though they are coming from someone else. God said it. God appeared. God is bothering him again. For years, there's this tiny bit of distance between Punpun and the things happening inside his head. Then eventually that distance disappears. And I think that's also why God's realistic face works so well. Punpun is visually vague enough that we can project ourselves onto him. God is horribly specific. This giant human face suddenly appears in Punpun's world and forces itself into the moment. It feels intrusive because God himself is intrusive. It feels like a thought that has become so loud that Punpun can look at it directly, which is why one of the weirdest jokes in the first chapter becomes one of the creepiest things in the entire manga. God doesn't suddenly transform into a monster. He keeps smiling. Punpun is the one who changes. And by the time Punpun finally understands who he has been speaking to, the question isn't really whether God exists anymore. The question is how long Punpun needed to believe that that voice actually belonged to him.